All right, world history students. I know we got quite a few lectures this week, but here we go. The last one of the week, that is the Crusades, as we highlight the rise and eventual fall of papal power in medieval Europe. So let's jump right in. Pretty controversial or well-known, but often misunderstood time of medieval history. All right, here we go. Let's set the stage with our first point in talking about Islamic expansion. We'll be looking at Islam in more detail in class, but it originates with the conversion of Muhammad in approximately 600 AD, so 600 years after Christ. We get the emergence of a new major world faith, and that is Islam. Muhammad, during his lifetime, again, the founder of Islam, he conquers most of the Arabian Peninsula. And so he is a war leader. He does lead an expansion militarily of the Islamic belief system, and basically has control of much of the Arabian Peninsula at the time of his death. Within the next two generations of Muhammad, his followers, they conquer more and more territory. They continue this expansion. They conquer Jerusalem, Persia, Egypt, North Africa, and even up into Europe proper, Spain. And so in about 100 years, so by approximately 700 AD, Islam has expanded very, very quickly. And half of all Christians, formerly living in quote unquote Christian lands, now live under Muslim rule. And so that's an important setup, is the rapid and very quick military expansion of Islam following the life and conversion of Muhammad. And so there you can see the initial territory within the Arabian Peninsula, and then the orange territory added by the first four caliphs, or those following Muhammad, and then by 750 up to the pink territory. And so a lot of times we think of the Middle East today as being Islamic. However, for the first 600 years of Christianity, these were Christian lands. Egypt was a Christian center. In fact, one of the most powerful churches was in Egypt. North Africa was Christian. The Tigris Euphrates, what we think of as Persia and Iraq, they were Christian. And it was just this rapid expansion that began to change that, and even to begin to press into Europe proper through Spain there on the left, and into Eastern Europe through Turkey there on the right. At the heart of Christianity and Judaism have the Ten Commandments. We talked about the seven sacraments of the Catholic Church. In Islam, you have one of its foundational ways of understanding it foundationally is its five pillars. And those five pillars are: one, the declaration of faith, in which you testify that there is one God and there's no other God but Allah, and that Muhammad is his prophet. That's kind of you shall love the Lord your God and him only, and love your neighbor as yourself, like for Christianity. That's kind of the declaration of faith for a Muslim. Then there is the pillar of prayer, in which a Muslim is called to pray 5 times a day towards the holy city of Mecca. Then there is the pillar of fasting, in which Muslims are called to fast during the holy month of Ramadan, during daylight hours from sun up to sundown. This was the month in which Muhammad is said to have received the revelation of the Quran, which is the holy book of Islam, from the angel Gabriel. And so the month of Ramadan is a period of daylight fasting. There's also the giving of alms, or zakat, and that is that all Muslims are called to give to charity and give to the poor, especially during that month of Ramadan. And then there is the Hajj, or the pilgrimage, in which all faithful Muslims are called to make a pilgrimage to the holy city of Mecca at least once during their lifetime. And so these are kind of the 5. If you're going to be a Orthodox Muslim, these are the 5 pillars of the Islamic faith. However, also built into the teachings of the Quran is what many people label the 6th pillar. Now, this is an unofficial pillar, but it is a kind of a teaching or a doctrine, and that is that of jihad. Jihad translates as struggle or holy war. And it's meant in one of 2 ways, and some sides say it's only meant in the first way. Others say no, it's very clearly meant in both ways. Just look at the life of Muhammad himself and his followers. But the struggle or holy war, in one sense, is an internal struggle. It's a struggle against sin. It's a struggle against unfaithfulness. It's a struggle to conform yourself and to serve Allah and his prophet Muhammad. But the struggle also, many Muslims, especially it seems the early adherents, and then you have what we call radical Islamic believers today, that this infers an external struggle against unbelievers, and that all Muslims, in addition to the first 5 pillars mentioned, they are also called to the 6th pillar of jihad to struggle against unbelievers, to conquer them and to bring them into submission or bring them into the faith of Muhammad. And now this jihad, to wage jihad, is the only guarantee, according to the Quran, of salvation, which means it gives it a lot of weight. In that the salvation of a Muslim is oftentimes, they're said to be kind of in humility, but also insecurity. It's unknown to them whether they're going to heaven or whether Allah approves of them. They don't know for sure. They can't be sure, and they hope so, and they hope they've done more faithfulness than unfaithfulness. But if they wage holy war against infidels and unbelievers, then they die in the process of jihad, then they're guaranteed salvation. And so that gives the urge among many Islamic belief systems to wage jihad a lot of weight because of that guarantee. This is a quote, an excerpt from the fifth verse of the ninth surah that says, then when the sacred months have passed, slay the idolaters wherever you find them, unbelievers, people who are worshiping anything but the true God Allah. Take them captive and besiege them and prepare for them each ambush. But if they repent and establish worship and pay the poor due, then leave their way free. Lo, Allah is forgiving and merciful. And this is one of the verses cited, saying with the calling of not only an internal jihad, but an external jihad, that we are to go and to aggressively subdue unbelievers and either convert them or at least have them pay a tax, pay a tithe, a poor due, pay a submission to Muslim rule, and then they can be left alone. And so this, for these Islamic kingdoms during this time of expansion, this was the practice, and one of the reasons in which, by the tip of the sword, Islam spread very, very quickly and overwhelmed, again, half of the initially Christian territories. In the 11th century, a change began, not with this expansion. Two key moments. One is a new group of Muslim believers, a group of Seljuk Turks, just like you had different ethnicities and groups who would become Christian, Vandals and Goths and Angles and Saxons, etc. You'd have different Middle Eastern, and Arab peoples convert. And one of these was the Seljuk Turks. And when they came into power in the Middle East, they took control of Jerusalem. And for under other regimes, Christian crusaders and Christian pilgrims had been allowed to come in and visit the holy city. The Seljuk Turks, however, they shut off access to pilgrims and Christians from Europe having access to the holy city of Jerusalem. The Seljuk Turks also began to aggressively attack Eastern Rome, or the Byzantine Empire, there in Turkey. And so these two threats, the closing of Jerusalem to Christian pilgrims and also the renewed acts of aggression against Europe from the east in the land of Turkey against the Byzantine Empire, this caused the emperor of the Byzantine there in Constantinople. If you remember, we talked about the fall of Rome. Really, only the Rome in the west fell in around 500 AD. In the east, you had the Eastern Roman Empire, with the capital of Constantinople still standing. And that's still, we call that the Byzantine Empire, though basically it's Eastern Rome. They're still around. However, they're under heavy pressure from these Seljuk Turks, and they turn to the Pope in Rome, who happens to be a Pope named Urban II, saying, hey, help us. We're being overwhelmed by this renewed effort at expansion by these Islamic peoples. Okay, so that's the setup for what the calling of the Crusades. Now, in the second point, we're talking about this concept of Christendom. And it's kind of a link of these two key words, Christianity and kingdom. And when we say Christendom, we mean something very specific. We don't just mean, Christian peoples, but it kind of refers to this moment in time, or this mindset in which the church attempted to create God's kingdom here on earth. We're going to live within Babylon, we're going to live within Rome, we're going to live within England, we're going to live within these pagan peoples, and we're going to convert them to Christianity. But no, that Christianity is both the religious and the political ruler of the area. And so Christendom refers to a high point of Catholic or papal power in Europe, when again you had the church serving as both an earthly as well as spiritual ruler, uniting, as it says there, spiritual and worldly rule. I would argue that this is a very dangerous time for the church, because it's ignoring some very important callings in Scripture, where Jesus himself spoke of warned against establishing a kingdom here on earth, saying, my kingdom is not of this world. He's saying we're not to rule by force, that Christian rulers aren't supposed to rule like the Gentiles. They're supposed to be the servants of all. Or he warning Peter, if you're going to live by the sword, you're going to die by the sword. And that's not an exhaustive argument, but it's definitely a warning at the very least, to watch out of mixing your spiritual warfare and your desire to convert and evangelize and reach out to others, and your desire to rule politically, and your desire to rule by force and rule by law and rule by the warfare and armies. But this is a moment of rising power in Europe. It's the Catholic Church that has been the glue that's held Europe together, and now they're flexing the muscles of this concept of Christendom, a Christian kingdom. And it's in that context that asking help, the cry for help comes from the emperor of Eastern Rome against the Seljuk Turks, that Pope Urban II in 1095 calls for a crusade, a holy war, a holy endeavor, to help Constantinople from invasion, and to also to go and retake the holy city of Jerusalem, being considered the most holy center of the Jewish and, of course, the Christian faith. The Muslims also saw it as a holy land, and so obviously it's a very contested area to this very day. But this is the first time that the Pope, they had crusades sometimes called against other Islamic invasions in other parts of Europe, but this was the first official call of the formal retaking of the Holy Land in defense of the Byzantine Empire. And in making this call, Pope Urban offers two very important promises. He's primarily talking to a group of Frankish lords from France, and he's saying, you're going to be given an indulgence, a promise of salvation. In other words, we talked about the act of penance, that the church would give Christian believers something to do to show their true absolution from sin. And so they could say, if you go on this crusade, if you go and fight, it's a lot like the concept of jihad. If you go and fight and serve in the cause of retaking Jerusalem against the unholy Muslims, then you'll be saved, you'll be forgiven, and you'll have salvation. Very, very unbiblical. But we're going to read the text. That's the call. Also promises land and wealth, saying basically, we're getting a little crammed here in Europe. You can go and take new lands and rule them and increase in wealth, which we'll see is definitely not the fate that most crusaders ended up with during any of the Crusades. And of course, this meeting, this call, his speech ends with this cry of Deus Vult, or Deus Vult, God wills it. This is the will of God. Very, very similar to, a Muslim counterpart of Allahu Akbar, God is great, often yelled at the act of jihad. This was Deus Vult. He says, whenever you meet the enemy during this crusade, just say, God wills it. God wills for you to go and make war. And again, this is very much a problematic attitude to anybody who's read Scripture closely, and yet a lot of these, unfortunately, we'll talk about, they didn't read Scripture closely, and it was the Pope had this monarchical God-king authority to tell people this is the path to salvation, this is in fact the will of God. And so in this call, this really represents, and the start of the Crusades themselves, they kind of represent a high point of the papal monarchy. In the previous lecture, we talked about popes going from survivors to competitors, and then eventually rulers, and then eventually schism. We're really at that high point of rulership, where again the Pope claims to control salvation. It's not between you and Jesus; it's between you and the Church, and the Pope can control that. You're excommunicated if you don't obey. If you go and do this act of war, you're going to go to heaven. Regardless of the state of your heart or your relationship with Jesus or your own motives for going on the crusade. He's able to order kings. Again, we talked about this power play between kings and Pope. This is the Pope calling upon kings, the most powerful secular men, to go on these crusades. They have that authority at this time. The Pope's going to collect money from indulgences and spoils as the result of tithes from the Crusaders as the result of the Crusades. And again, they're going to basically be able to call together an army to go against external foes. This is a long way from Leo I, when popes were just trying to hold it together as Rome's being overwhelmed by outside invaders. Now we have the establishment of this Christendom, and the Pope is a monarch. He is a ruler and a God king, able to, again, direct political forces of mass invasions of external foes into Jerusalem. And so lastly, we're going to be looking at, so what were the major events of the actual Crusades? Talking about the lead up and expansion, this idea of Christendom and what it represents. And finally, we're going to look at the four, there's lots of details that we could break this down to, but we're going to look at it as four basic Crusades. The first being the one that Pope Urban II calls for in 1095. It is successful in that this group of Crusaders, they do retake Jerusalem and they establish a Christian kingdom in the Holy Land for about 100 years. And so in some ways, in terms of just did they win the war? Did they achieve what they were trying to do? The First Crusade does succeed, and Jerusalem is under Christian rule for about, again, several generations or about 100 years. Here's a map of those Crusader kingdoms established by the First Crusade. You got all the way. You can notice, you can see they started up in the north, and that's the south of Turkey, where it says Little Armenia, and then made their way down along the coast through Syria and those areas down until finally reaching Jerusalem. And then these were under Christian control for the next couple generations. The Second Crusade is called again a generation later or so in response to Muslim attempts to retake Jerusalem, and so they're under siege, and so they rally the Second Crusade to go into to their defense. This set of crusaders, however, are defeated by Turkish armies, never even make it to the Holy Land. Jerusalem's able to hold out, but this crusade largely fails in that they're not able to actually even reach the Holy Land. They're defeated in Turkey on the way there. The Third Crusade is oftentimes one of the most famous, and that is because three prominent kings from Europe went on the crusade. Richard the Lionheart of England, Frederick Barbarossa of the Holy Roman Empire. They're basically Germany. And then Philip Augustus from France. However, even this was a bit of a mess because Frederick drowns on the way to the crusade, I think in France or Italy on the way. Philip and Richard get in an argument, and Philip decides, well, I'm just going home. I'm not going to participate in this. And then it's only Richard who makes it to the Holy Land to battle famously one of the most famous Muslim leaders, a man named Saladin. They fight it kind of to a stalemate. Richard's able to gain some land, and ultimately they reach a negotiation in which Saladin retains control of Jerusalem. Jerusalem is no longer under the control of Christians or Europeans, but they at least have access, and pilgrims can once again enter the city, come and go, and visit the holy sites there. So that's our Third Crusade. And we have here Richard on the left, Saladin on the right. In the middle is a famous moment in which they were parleying prior to battle, and Saladin's showing off the sharpness of his sword by being able to cut through a silk scarf as it floats through the air. And again, they fought each other to a stalemate. The Fourth Crusade is kind of what it characterizes kind of the whimper that ends the crusading centuries. And just keep in mind, these are not crusades. When you say four crusades, look at the time difference. We started in 1095, and now it's roughly 1200 AD. So this is a multi-generational movement. And this one's called by actually what we put as one of the most powerful pope ever during the medieval time, and that is Pope Innocent III. And he once again is calling on crusaders to go and free the Holy Land from Saladin's descendants, from Muslim control, because the Christian crusaders are no longer there. However, this one's a mess from the beginning. The Crusaders, in order to fund their crusade, crusading was extremely expensive, extremely dangerous, largely from disease and travel, not to even mention the warfare. And most of the Crusaders came back very, very poor. So this wasn't something that ended in success for a lot of Crusaders, either death or they'd come back and they've lost all their wealth. But this Crusader group, in order to pay for the trip, they actually destroy Christian towns. And so they're basically robbing Christians to go serve on a Christian crusade. And then they arrive at the city of Constantinople, and kind of a argument erupts, and they end up laying siege to the Christian capital of Eastern Rome, the Byzantine Empire, Constantinople itself. And they end up destroying and burning the city of Constantinople. These are Christians against Christians. This is not Christians against Muslim. This is not in the Holy Land. This is the capital city of the remnants of the Roman Empire in the East. And they're basically fighting each other. And so it's just a complete disaster. And even this conflict is going to lead to the eventual conquering of Constantinople by Muslims not too long afterwards. And so largely an embarrassment, a disaster from the beginning, and a sign that the real spiritual or holy impetus to these crusades had largely fallen away. And after the embarrassment and the failure of this crusade, crusading begins to go out of fashion. This is just a map of those four crusades. You can see the first crusade, first, second, third, and fourth, and the territories that were in dispute. Another area largely where there were many crusades called, but it's not necessarily the subject of this lecture, is you can see Spain. was conquered by Muslims as early as the 700s AD. And by this time, there have been continual efforts to push Muslims out of Spain, and they're about halfway there. And Spain will finally be reconquered in the name of Christendom in 1492. So a very, very long ongoing process. The second half of these Middle Ages is largely a fight for survival between Christian Europe and the expanding Muslim armies in the east and southwest. So, kind of the impact of the Crusades. Militarily, kind of accomplished very little. They take the Holy Land, they lose the Holy Land, they negotiate access to the Holy Land. That doesn't really change the dynamics of power. Other than is that they do serve as kind of a defensive counterpunch. Again, in up until 1095, Europeans had been on the retreat as Islam expanded, both from France in the west and from Turkey in the east. This was kind of the first counterpunch by Christian Europe to say, no, this expansion needs to stop. And to a large extent, the Crusades, did succeed in slowing that expansion. However, in terms of retaking the Holy Land or enriching Europe, they were a failure. And in fact, for a time, they strengthened the authority of the Pope to, again, send people on, and kings and lords on these crusades. By the end, they'd gone so out of fashion and proven such a failure that it actually weakened the authority of the Pope, and the Pope was left, making these rallying cries for crusades. But after so many failures, the kings and a lot of Europeans, largely stopped listening to the Pope as far as going on crusades. And probably the biggest impact of the Crusades was setting the stage for a rebirth, a financial and cultural rebirth, which we call now the Renaissance in Europe, because of contact that the Crusaders, particularly European merchants, have in accumulating wealth in supplying the Crusaders, and also in coming in trade contact with Muslim counterparts. And so the exchange of ideas, the exchange of wealth, the exchange of commodities, that actually greatly enriches and provides new opportunities in Europe. And you begin to get the emergence of a middle class, the emergence of a merchant city class, the growth of towns. And we'll be talking about this when we get to the Renaissance. But this is probably the more widespread impact of the Crusades, is this renewed interaction. Again, violence at many times, but also in other contexts, more peaceable, that is going to lead to a revival of Europe. Also, in addition to the wealth, is the exposure to Islamic culture and lost classical texts. Again, we talked about the quick expansion of Islam into Christian lands. It was a lot of these Islamic nations, they were in control of, or had access to, a lot of the lost Christian, Roman, and Greek texts that had been quote unquote lost during the Middle Ages, and renewed access to those books of learning and to those authors is one of the results of the Crusades, and again, a highly beneficial one. And that influx of information as well as wealth is going to lead to, again, this period that we call the Renaissance, which we'll be covering after the break. So what? So what about the Crusades? One, as we emphasized, they are a sign of the papal monarchy, the power that the Pope had achieved in order to mobilize these vast armies, even very wealthy, powerful men of Europe, and send them on these, many times ill-advised, but expensive and dangerous crusades. It's also important, a lot of times the crusades are mischaracterized as these bloodlusty acts of aggression by Europeans against innocent bystanding Islamic peoples. No, there was a constant generational, centuries-long conflict between Islamic expansion and Europe, and in some ways the Crusades can be seen as largely defensive, that they were a chance to finally strike back and prevent the eventual overrunning of all of Europe by Islamic armies. And so they're a sign of growing European strength along with the popes. And again, they're going to, as we mentioned in the last slide, it's going to feed an economic and social revival in Europe. However, the failure of the Crusades, they're a sign of papal overreach, kind of the popes in asserting their power in trying to become the rulers of the world, as we talked about Pope Innocent III in the last lecture. They overreach, and they're weakening. And as the Crusades prove to really cost more in lives and wealth than they ever bring in, the kings and the secular rulers begin to start turning a deaf ear towards the Pope, and it's going to lead to a decline in their power. and finally a growing rift between the church or the popes and the state, the kings. And you kind of begin to get this shifting where the pope, again, when Rome fell, the power of princes or the emperors was in decline, and the pope slowly rose to prominence. The Crusades kind of represent a high point of papal dominance, and now it's going to slowly, we're going to see a shift the other way with the pope, the power of the Catholic Church going into decline, and the power of individual state kings, the King of England, the King of France, the King of Spain, becoming more and more powerful and influential. So that's one of the big takeaways. The Crusades and their eventual failure is a sign of this shifting in power relations. Okay, we'll dig into this into more detail. And I, again, as always, appreciate your attention and hard work in class. Talk to you soon.